A Werewolf Romance by Alpha's Claim Collection. Prologue. She had always known that loving him would cost her everything. She simply hadn't known it would cost her child something too. The snow had been falling for 3 hours by the time they dragged her to the Judgment Circle, and Seren had decided somewhere between the pack house steps and the frozen clearing that she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her shiver. She stood straight, her bound wrists held before her, her chin level, her dark eyes moving slowly across the gathered faces of the Ironvale pack. 212 wolves. She had counted them at festivals, at ceremonies, at the communal hunts she had once attended on the arm of their alpha. She knew their names, their children's names, their petty grievances and quiet kindnesses. She had spent 3 years learning this pack the way you learn a home. The way you memorize the creaking step on the staircase and the window that sticks in summer and the particular way afternoon light falls golden through the kitchen at 4 o'clock. She had loved this place. Looking at it now, she understood that it had never loved her back. The snow continued falling, indifferent and beautiful, settling in the dark hair that hung loose around her shoulders because they hadn't given her time to pin it. Settling on her lashes, her cheekbones, the curve of her stomach that her bound hands could not reach to shield. The child inside her shifted. A slow, deliberate movement, as though even at 7 months the life she carried understood that stillness was required. That this was a moment demanding dignity. Hold on, Seren thought, pressing the words inward like a prayer. Just hold on, little one. Whatever happens tonight, I will not let them touch you. Elder Voss stood at the circle's center, his ceremonial robes pristine despite the weather, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time for something and is finally watching it arrive. He unrolled his scroll with deliberate slowness, letting the silence stretch until it became its own kind of cruelty. Seren did not look at him. She looked, instead, at the space 10 feet to his left, where Alpha Cain of Ironvale stood in his ceremonial blacks, silver rank markings gleaming at his collar, his face as carved and expressionless as the stone walls of the hall behind him. 8 months ago, that face had been the last thing she saw before sleep and the first thing she reached for upon waking. 8 months ago, those silver eyes had found hers across every crowded room as though the distance between them was a physical discomfort he was constantly correcting. She studied him now with the clinical detachment of a woman who had cried every tear available to her in the first month of exile, and had since discovered that what remained after grief was something harder and quieter and significantly more dangerous. She studied him, and she waited. Because she had something left to say. And the Ironvale pack was about to hear every word of it. Chapter 1. The Ceremony of Severance. It had started, as most disasters do, with good intentions. Seren had not planned to attend the blessing ceremony. For 6 months she had observed the terms of her exile with meticulous precision, remaining in the border town of Ashfin where the pack's outer territory frayed into neutral land, buying her bread from the human baker who asked no questions, sleeping in the room above the tanner's shop whose elderly owner had simply slid a key across the counter the morning she arrived with her travel pack and hollow eyes, and asked if he knew of any available lodgings. She had not attended pack events. She had not crossed the inner boundary markers. She had not sent word to former friends, most of whom had made the nature of their loyalty sufficiently clear in the hours following her rejection, turning away with the specific efficiency of people who have already calculated what association costs. She had kept to herself. She had survived. And then her brother Eli had sent a letter. 3 sentences, characteristically spare. I'm being initiated at the blessing ceremony. I know you can't come. I understand. It was the 3rd sentence that had undone her. The particular grammar of someone who has accepted a wound and is simply documenting it. I understand. Not a forgiveness. Not an invitation. Just a small, careful surrender from the only family she had left. She had folded the letter, pressed it flat against her chest, and had her traveling boots on within the hour. She arrived as the ceremony began, slipping in at the back of the gathered crowd, hood drawn, standing behind the taller wolves where the firelight wouldn't quite reach her face. She did not intend to speak to anyone. She simply needed Eli to be able to look out at the crowd and find her there, whether he recognized her or not. Whether he acknowledged her or not. She simply needed him to know that she had come. The blessing ceremony was one of the oldest of the Ironvale traditions, predating the current pack structure by several hundred years. Each newly bonded mate stepped forward to receive the moon goddess's mark on their wrist, a deepening of the mate bond, a public sanctification. The newly initiated young wolves were blessed next, their rank marks activated by the pack's senior wolves in a ceremony that was equal parts sacred and celebratory. She watched it from the shadows, one hand resting against her stomach in the habit she had developed without noticing, the way you develop any habit that keeps you anchored. The child moved. Slow, comfortable rolling. I know, she thought. I see him too. Because of course she saw him. Cain stood at the ceremony's center in his alpha's position, formal and composed, performing the blessing marks with the precise authority that had always been his most natural expression. She had once found that authority breathtaking, had mistaken the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed for the security of a man who would choose her. That had been the central error of her life. Eli stepped forward with his initiation cohort, 7 young wolves between 16 and 18, their faces bright with the particular luminous anxiety of a significant night. She found him immediately. Saw the moment his eyes swept the crowd with the unconscious searching look of someone who expects to find nothing but is looking anyway. She pushed her hood back. Just enough. He found her. Something moved across his face, complicated and swift. Not quite a smile. Not quite relief. Something that lived in the difficult space between the two. She nodded once. He looked away. Back to the elder before him. It was enough. She had told herself it would be enough, and she intended to hold to that. She was already easing backward through the crowd, already preparing her quiet exit when Elder Voss turned. He was 70 years old, white-haired, sharp as a winter wind, and he had never once in 3 years made any effort to conceal his opinion of the packless woman their alpha had inexplicably chosen as a mate. He had been the loudest voice at her rejection. She suspected he had helped orchestrate the terms of her exile with considerable enthusiasm. His eyes found her in the crowd with the accuracy of a man who has been waiting for exactly this. The drums faltered. The crowd stilled. Elder Voss's voice cut through the ceremony like a blade through silk. Remove the exile. She defiles the blessing with her presence. 212 wolves turned. The crowd parted around her. Not violently, not with shouts or threats, simply with the steady wordless movement of people creating distance from something they have been instructed to consider contagious. Faces she knew. Faces that had smiled at her over dinner tables, that had danced near her at festivals, that had once handed her their infants to hold while they poured drinks. She stood still as they moved away from her, holding herself straight, her hood fallen to her shoulders, making no effort to hide or retreat. She was looking at Eli. He was looking at the ground. That small fact landed inside her with the soft, devastating precision of something falling from a great height onto something fragile. She felt it break. Something she had been saving, something she had carried all the way from Ashfin through the snow on the specific hope that it existed. Her brother did not look up. 2 pack enforcers reached her. She turned and walked with them before they could take her arms, because she would not be dragged, and they would know the difference. The judgment circle was already lit when they arrived. As though it had been prepared. As though someone had known. She was placed at the center. Her wrists were bound. The snow fell. And Elder Voss unrolled his scroll. She heard the charge read aloud in that carrying, ceremonial voice, the ancient language given its formal due. Bearing an illegitimate heir within pack borders during exile. She heard the punishment. Banishment beyond the frost boundary. She heard the gathered wolves absorbing it, the particular silence of a crowd that is not surprised and is choosing not to be troubled by that fact. She waited until Voss reached the customary closing. Does the exile have anything to say in answer to this charge? The snow fell. The fire crackled. The wolves waited. Seren lifted her chin. Only that the father of this child, she said, and her voice came out steady and clear and carrying in the winter air, is standing 10 feet behind you. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. She kept her eyes on Elder Voss and watched him go very still. Watched the calculation move behind his eyes. Watched the moment he decided on his strategy. But it didn't matter what he decided, because the Iron Veil pack was already turning to look at their alpha. And Cain's face, that carved, controlled, expressionless face she had studied so carefully 8 months ago, was doing something she had never seen it do before. It was giving nothing away with what appeared to be tremendous effort. Which was, in its own way, everything. Chapter 2. What Cain burned away. She did not look at him directly. She had learned, in the months since her exile, that there were things you could survive and things that merely looked survivable from a distance. Looking directly at Cain in this moment fell into the second category. She looked instead at the middle distance, the place where the firelight blurred into shadow, and she let the silence do its work. The memory came the way it always came now. Not in ordered sequence, not with the narrative courtesy of beginning and middle, but in fragments. Sensory. Specific. The way trauma remembers, selecting its evidence carefully. 8 months ago. The Great Hall of Iron Veil, prepared with ceremonial torches, because Cain's father had just been buried that morning and the will reading had occurred that afternoon, and by evening the pack's senior elders had already found their way to their alpha's door with a proposal that could not be refused. She had been in the hall. She remembered that. Had been standing near the western wall, holding a cup of something warm that she wasn't drinking, watching Cain speak with Elder Voss and 2 others whose names she couldn't now recall. She remembered thinking he looked tired. Remembered planning to take him somewhere quiet when the formalities concluded. She had still believed, then, that she was included in his plans. He found her afterward. Let everyone else file out. Let the torches burn lower. There's something I have to tell you, he said. She had heard the distance in his voice before he finished the sentence. The careful engineering of it, the absence of the warmth she had come to expect as simply the weather between them. She had known, standing there, holding her cooling cup. She had known before the words came. She simply hadn't known what form it would take. My father's will contains a condition of succession. An alliance marriage with Stonecrest. Their alpha's daughter. A pause calibrated to the exact length of a man who has rehearsed this. The territory merger alone would double Iron Veil's northern boundary. It would protect the pack for 3 generations. Cain, she said. I've decided to accept the condition. The cup was cold. She noticed that. The specific temperature of it in her hands. I see, she said. Seren. Don't, she said. Quietly. Please don't explain it to me as though I haven't already understood. The rejection ceremony was the following morning. He had apparently required only 1 night to arrange it. She had spent that night sitting on the edge of their bed, his bed. She corrected herself even as she sat there. She should have been correcting herself from the beginning, staring at the window until the dark went gray. Pack assembled. Torches. Formal attendance. Elder Voss had read the severance declaration with unconcealed pleasure. Cain's voice, when he spoke the words, had been flat as winter ice. She would not have called it cold. Cold implies temperature. This was simply the absence of everything. I, Alpha Cain of Iron Veil, hereby sever the mate bond with Seren of no rank. Of no rank. She hadn't known they would include that. Some careful cruelty in the phrasing, a reminder that she had been elevated by association and would now be returned to her original state. The brand had been heated in advance. Silver, because silver disrupted shifter healing, would prevent the wound from simply reknitting over the mate mark. She had known it was coming, and still the sight of it moving toward her wrist had required every remaining resource of her composure. The pain was extraordinary. She did not make a sound. She had decided, watching the brand approach, that she would not give them her voice. She would not give them the sound of her undoing. She would carry it inside, and they would never know what it had cost. She walked out of the ceremony on her own feet. She did not look back. She found out she was carrying his child 3 weeks later in a border town inn, a traveling healer's face shifting into the particular expression of someone delivering news they cannot adequately prepare you for. She sat with it for a long time after the healer left. Then she ordered dinner, because the child would need her to eat, and she ate it, and she began planning for the only future available to her, which was the one directly in front of her face, taken one careful step at a time. Back in the judgment circle, Elder Voss had recovered his composure. The Alpha has no knowledge of this claim, he said smoothly, addressing the pack with the practiced ease of a man who has managed difficult narratives before. It is a desperate declaration from a desperate woman seeking to avoid just punishment. The identity of the exile's companion in her disgrace is not relevant to her companion, said a woman near the front of the crowd, one Seren recognized, a mid-rank wolf named Bessa who had always been quietly decent. Is the alpha of this pack? A low current moved through the gathered wolves. Not anger, exactly. Something more uncomfortable. The particular unease of people who have allowed themselves to look away from something and are now being made to look directly at it. Elder Voss's voice sharpened. The charge stands regardless of. The charge, said a different voice, should probably be paused. Seren's attention shifted. At the circle's edge, a figure pressed forward through the crowd. Tall, dark-cloaked, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never once needed to push their way through anything and is merely choosing to walk in this direction. The silver insignia at his collar caught the firelight. The High Alpha Council seal. She recognized it from old documents. Most of the pack, judging by their reaction, recognized it too. Elder Voss went very still. The stranger stopped at the circle's edge and regarded the scene before him with calm, dark eyes that took in Seren's bound wrists, her condition, the brand scar visible at her wrist, and Elder Voss's scroll, in what appeared to be a single, cataloging glance. I'd advise you to pause that sentence, he said, addressing Voss with the particular courtesy of someone who is not making a request, before you make a very permanent mistake. The fire crackled. The snow fell. Elder Voss's scroll, Seren noticed with quiet satisfaction, was trembling very slightly in his hands. Cain's voice came from behind her, measured and controlled. Council Enforcer. We were not informed of a visitation. No, the stranger agreed pleasantly. You weren't. Chapter 3. The Councilman's Interest. His name was Aldrich. She learned this when Elder Voss, with the stiff formality of a man swallowing something deeply unpalatable, addressed him by title in the Alpha's hall. Enforcer Aldrich. The honorific carried the weight of the council's full authority, which sat above pack law the way the sky sits above everything else. Present, vast, rarely noticed until it decides to make itself felt. The hall held 8 people. Seren, her wrists now unbound at Aldrich's single quiet request to the enforcers, stood to one side. Cain stood opposite, flanked by Elder Voss and 2 senior wolves. Aldrich stood at the table's head as though it had been his room all along. He had brought a case. Dark leather, council sealed, set on the table with careful precision. He did not open it immediately. He looked at each person in the room first, taking his time, and Seren had the impression of someone reading a document rather than a gathering of people. His eyes reached her last. They were darker than she'd first noted. Brown deepening toward black, calm in the way that still water is calm, with the suggestion of considerable depth beneath. He looked at her wrists. At the silver brand scar. At her stomach. Nothing in his expression shifted, but something in his attention did. A slight settling, as though he had confirmed something he had suspected. He opened the case. The child this woman carries, he said, without preamble, his voice filling the hall without effort, carries a bloodline the council has been tracking for 3 generations. He removed a document. Ancient leather binding, the council's double moon seal pressed in silver wax. A bloodline registry, she realized, recognizing the format from historical texts she had read in better days. A dormant gene, Aldrich continued, setting the document on the table and opening it to a page marked with a narrow ribbon that has not surfaced in a living air in over a century. Elder Voss moved forward with the reflexive authority of a man unaccustomed to information arriving without his involvement. He looked at the document, and whatever he read there rearranged his expression into something Seren had never seen on his face before. Uncertainty. The Pale Wolf lineage, Voss said quietly. Not a question. The Pale Wolf lineage, Aldrich confirmed. The name settled into the hall like a stone into deep water, the ripples reaching everyone in the room at slightly different intervals. Seren watched them land. Watched Voss's uncertainty deepen into something complicated. Watched the two senior wolves exchange a glance weighted with history she didn't fully possess. Watched Cain. His face did what it always did, constructed its careful absence. But his eyes moved to her stomach, and they stayed there for a moment too long. She understood the significance of the name. Everyone in any pack understood the significance. The Pale Wolves were not merely a powerful bloodline. They were woven into the oldest pack mythology, into the founding stories told to children at firesides. Direct descendants of the moon goddess herself, the oldest texts claimed. Born into pure white wolf forms. Considered sacred by packs that had long since stopped using that word for anything. The last confirmed pale wolf had been killed in the border wars 60 years ago. Hunters, some accounts said. A rival pack's fear of what the bloodline represented, said others. Whatever the cause, the lineage had been considered lost. You're certain, Cain said. The first words he had spoken since they entered the hall. His voice was controlled, but Seren, who had spent 3 years learning its registers, heard the thing underneath. Not wonder. Calculation. The specific precision of a man who has just been handed a variable that changes every equation he had already solved. The Council's blood work is not uncertain, Aldrich replied simply. How? The question came from Seren herself, slipping out before she could consider its propriety. My family has no record of that lineage. It was dormant, Aldrich said, turning to her with the same direct attention he had offered her in the circle. The difference, she noted, was that he spoke to her as though her question was a reasonable one. As though she was a reasonable person who had asked it. The distinction, absurd as it seemed, was remarkable in this room, in this hall, among these men. Dormant genes can remain invisible for generations, then surface without warning when the right two bloodlines combine. He did not look at Cain when he said it. He didn't need to. The implication was its own presence in the room. Elder Voss had spent the preceding minutes composing himself, and he now employed his recovered authority with the urgency of a man aware that a situation is rearranging itself around him. The child's lineage, significant as it may be, does not alter the circumstances of its birth, he said, addressing Aldrich with the precision of a legal argument. Nor does it alter the terms of the exile. The pack has a legitimate claim to recognize and protect a pale wolf airborne within its territory, which in fact strengthens the case for bringing the child under pack wardship. The child, Seren said, has a name. She has a mother. And she is not a political asset. Silence. Voss turned to look at her with the expression of a man encountering an interruption from furniture. She, said Aldrich. Seren met his eyes. I don't know yet. But she. Something moved in his expression. Brief, quickly managed, but present. A warmth that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there all along, and this was simply the moment it surfaced. He looked back at the table. The Council's position, he said, his voice resuming its formal register, is that the exile status and proposed banishment of this woman is to be suspended pending full review. The child's welfare and the mother's safety are now Council matters. Pack jurisdiction is secondary. Elder Voss drew breath. Furthermore, Aldrich continued, and the additional word was its own kind of silencing, the Council takes a dim view of circumstances in which a pregnant woman is bound and placed in a judgment circle in a blizzard. I'll be including the full details of this evening's events in my report. The two senior wolves were now studying the middle distance with the dedication of men who have decided they were never really part of this and would prefer the record to reflect that. What do you want? Seren spoke it into the hall's strained quiet. She addressed Aldrich directly because she had been standing in rooms with men discussing her future for several hours now, and she had reached the precise end of her patience with the practice. He turned to her fully. She met his eyes and kept her voice level. Everyone in this room wants something from me or from what I'm carrying. You arrived at exactly the right moment with exactly the right document. So tell me plainly. What does the council want? The hall was very quiet. Aldrich studied her for a moment, and she had the sense of being genuinely looked at rather than assessed, as though the distinction mattered to him. Right now, he said, I want to make sure you survive the night. A brief pause. The rest we can discuss when you're not surrounded by people who have already decided that your value is only what you're carrying. The words were so precisely what she had needed to hear that she felt them land somewhere unexpectedly soft. Somewhere she had spent 8 months carefully armoring. She looked away before he could see it. She stays, said Cain. His voice came from across the table. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the bloodline registry. His jaw was set, his tone was clipped, the voice of a man issuing a tactical directive. Underpack protection until the child is born. The hall absorbed this. Elder Voss began to speak and then appeared to reconsider, which was, in Seren's experience, unprecedented. She waited. She waited to feel something at those words. Some residual warmth. Some ghost of what she had once felt when his voice announced her inclusion rather than her exclusion. There was nothing. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. The child moved, that slow, deliberate shift she had come to recognize as simply presence. Simply, I am here. I am here. I am here. Underpack protection, Seren said quietly. She looked at the brand scar on her wrist. At the table where the bloodline registry lay open. At Elder Voss's carefully composed expression and the two wolves' careful distance and Cain's careful profile. Underpack protection. Not, I was wrong. Not, I am sorry. Not even, she is mine. A tactical decision. Made about her body, her child, her future, as dispassionately as one makes decisions about territory. And somewhere inside her, in a place she hadn't fully acknowledged, was still soft, the last fragile thing she had been keeping safe simply and quietly stopped. Not with devastation. Not with rage. With a finality that was, in its own way, more complete than either. She turned and looked at Aldrich, who was watching her with those calm, deep eyes, and she thought that he understood what had just happened in her. That he had watched it occur and had not made the error of filling the space it left with words or comfort or anything other than the simple, steady acknowledgement of his attention. I'll require separate chambers, she said. Not my previous ones. Of course, Aldrich said. She nodded once. Then she walked out of the Alpha's hall, through the torchlit corridor, into the cold night air that tasted of snow and pine, and she breathed it in slowly. Behind her, she heard nothing from Cain. She had stopped waiting for it. That, she thought, pressing her palm one more time against the curve of her stomach, was its own kind of freedom. Chapter 4. Rooms in the house that rejected you. The chambers they gave her were on the eastern wing's second floor. Small, functional, facing the back courtyard rather than the front approach. The furniture was adequate. The hearth worked. The window latch stuck slightly, which she discovered on her first night, and fixed herself with a piece of folded paper wedged into the frame, because she had learned in 8 months of exile that waiting for someone else to fix the small discomforts was simply a way of collecting them. She did not unpack her travel bag entirely. She told herself this was practicality. She was a temporary presence here, a suspended exile, a council matter. This was not her home. She had simply run out of other places to be. The first morning, breakfast did not arrive. She waited an hour past the time she heard the rest of the pack house stirring, listening to the sounds of movement in corridors, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the specific acoustic evidence of a household feeding itself and declining to include her. Then she dressed, went downstairs, walked into the kitchen where 2 pack women went carefully still at the sight of her, took a plate from the shelf, filled it herself from the pots on the range, and carried it back upstairs without a word. She ate at the window, watching snow fall on the empty courtyard. The child pressed against her ribs, steady and insistent. I'm here. Feed us. I know, she thought. I did. The pack's position on her presence arranged itself, as group positions do, into a rough landscape of attitudes. There were those who were openly cold. Elder Voss's contingent, the older families with political investments in the Stonecrest Alliance, the wolves who had always found her insufficiently pack-born and were now confirmed in their assessment. They moved past her in corridors with the practiced precision of people who have decided that eye contact constitutes acknowledgement and acknowledgement constitutes a position they are unwilling to hold. There were those who were quietly sympathetic. She recognized them by the particular quality of their not quite looking at her, the way they would set something down near her rather than handing it directly. The anonymous plate of warm bread she found outside her door on the third morning with no indication of its origin. Small, deniable kindnesses. The courage of people who possessed it in insufficient quantities for open acts, but could not quite bring themselves to nothing. She understood it. She did not blame them. Courage is unevenly distributed and pack structure punishes its public expression in the wrong direction. And then there were the children. 3 of them, between 6 and 10, who lived in the pack house with their parents and who had not yet acquired the social architecture that tells you which people to avoid and why. They found her on her 4th day in the eastern courtyard where she had taken to walking in the mornings because movement helped with the persistent ache in her lower back and because the courtyard was reliably empty. It was not empty that morning. The eldest, a girl of about 10 with her father's rank marks already beginning to ghost at her wrists, looked at Seren's stomach with the direct curiosity of someone who has not yet learned that staring is impolite. "Is there actually a baby in there?" she asked. "There is," Seren confirmed. "Can I touch it?" "Mira," said the younger boy beside her, with the weary tone of a sibling who has been managing this personality for years. "It's all right," Seren said. She took the girl's hand and placed it against her side, where the child had been active that morning. They waited. Then, obligingly, a slow rolling movement passed beneath the girl's palm. Myra's face transformed. Pure, uncomplicated wonder, the expression that belongs exclusively to children encountering something genuinely extraordinary for the first time. "It moved," she breathed. "She does that," Seren said. "How do you know it's a she?" "I don't. But she feels like a she." Mira considered this with great seriousness. "I feel like a she too," she said finally, as though this established a meaningful connection. Seren laughed. The sound surprised her. It had been a while since laughter had arrived without effort, without the slight delay of something that has to be manufactured from available materials. It felt like something unclenching. She had been at the pack house for 6 days when she first understood that Aldrich was watching over her. Not intrusively. Not with the hovering quality of a guard or the pointed visibility of a man who wants credit for his protection. Simply present, at the peripheral edges of her days, in a way that she began to notice only because she had trained herself, in exile, to notice everything. He was reading in the hall when she came downstairs one morning to find 2 pack males lingering outside her corridor with the specific purposeless energy of men who are not going anywhere but want to be seen not going there. They had moved away before she reached them. She had wondered then why. She understood when she reached the hall and found Aldrich already there, a book open on his knee. His dark eyes moving from the page to the corridor and back with the easy rhythm of someone who happens to be reading in this particular location for no particular reason. He glanced up. "Good morning," he said. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "I'm an early riser," he replied, which was not an answer. She sat in the chair across from him, because her back ached and the chair was comfortable, and because she found, without fully examining the reason, that the room felt different with him in it. Not safer, precisely. More honest. As though whatever the room actually was, it was willing to be that thing without pretense in his presence. "You don't have to do that," she said. He turned a page. "Do what?" "Arrange yourself between me and things that might go badly." He looked up then, directly, and she had the full attention of those dark, still eyes. "I know I don't have to," he said simply. "I'm choosing to." The distinction again. He was precise about distinctions. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone constructing a diplomatic answer, but of someone deciding how much of the true one to give. Because you've conducted yourself with more dignity than anyone in this pack house deserves, he said finally. And because you haven't asked a single person for anything, which means you won't ask when you actually need it. So I'm making myself available to be nearby without requiring you to ask. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a very considered answer, she said. You asked a direct question, he replied. You deserve a direct answer. She felt the warmth of it move through the careful architecture she had built around herself, not threatening the structure, just illuminating it briefly, the way a candle illuminates a room without changing its walls. She looked down at her hands. Thank you, she said quietly. He returned to his book. Don't mention it, he said, in the tone of someone who means it literally. It was Cain who complicated everything, as Cain had always complicated everything. He appeared on her 8th day. Not in her corridor, not at her door, but at the edge of the eastern courtyard where she was taking her morning walk, standing with his hands behind his back and his expression doing its careful nothing, watching her cross the courtyard with an attention she felt before she saw it. She stopped. He said nothing for a moment. The silence between them had its own specific texture now, different from the silences of their years together, which had been the comfortable silence of two people who had run out of need for words. This was the silence of a great deal of words that had not been said and were now exerting pressure from the inside. You look well, he said finally. She regarded him. I'm cold and my back hurts and your pack didn't feed me for the first 3 days, she said pleasantly. But other than that, something moved in his jaw. I didn't know about the food. No, she agreed. I don't imagine you checked. He looked at her stomach. That same look from the hall, the one she had catalogued and filed under the heading, too late and therefore irrelevant. Seren. Don't, she said. The same word she had used in the hall 8 months ago, carrying the same weight. Whatever you're about to say. Don't. I need to say it. You needed to say a great many things, she told him quietly, approximately 8 months ago. You chose not to. The moment for those words existed and you let it pass, Cain. Whatever you say now will simply be words that arrived too late to be anything other than a burden for me to carry. He stood very still. She deserves to know her father, he said. She, Seren repeated. You said she. In the hall. She turned and continued her walk, because her back ached and the morning was short and she had not yet had enough of the cold air and the quiet. Perhaps she does, she said, without turning back. Perhaps. But I'm the one who has to decide that. Not you. Not the elders. Not the council. Me. And right now I'm walking. She heard him say nothing further. She kept walking. That evening, she found the plate outside her door again. The anonymous bread, warm this time, with a small dish of honey beside it. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she picked it up, carried it inside, and ate it at the window with the honey, watching the courtyard go dark. Below, a figure moved across the snow. Aldrich, making his evening circuit that he did not acknowledge as a circuit. She watched him pause at the gate, check the latch, turn back. He glanced up. She was not sure if he could see her clearly in the dark window. But he stopped, briefly, and then continued, and she had the sense that the pause was its own kind of sentence. She finished her bread. She had thought, arriving here, that she simply needed to endure this place until the child was safely born and Aldrich's council review gave her the legal standing to leave. She had thought of it as a waiting room, a temporary arrangement between one life and the next. She had not expected to find, in the middle of everything that had hurt her here, the particular quiet warmth of a person who asked nothing and offered everything. She was not sure what to do with it. She was not sure she needed to do anything with it yet. She pressed her palm against her stomach, felt the answering movement, and decided that for now, simply noticing it was enough. 3 weeks into her residence, Cain's chosen mate came to find her. Seren had known this was coming the way you know certain weather is coming, by the quality of the air in the days before it arrives. She had caught glimpses of Mira, the other Mira, Cain's Mira, moving through the pack house with the careful awareness of a woman who is conscious of sharing space with her mate's former bond. She was younger than Seren had expected. 20, perhaps 21, with copper hair and steady green eyes and a bearing that suggested someone raised with considerable preparation for exactly this kind of life. The Stonecrest Alpha's daughter. The political solution. She was, in the precise and unwelcome way of things that hurt you, genuinely lovely. She knocked on Seren's door on a Tuesday afternoon. Seren opened it. They looked at each other. "I wanted to introduce myself properly," Mira said. Her voice was measured, not unkind. "Since the circumstances of our introduction have been strange." "That's a generous characterization," Seren said. The corner of Myra's mouth moved. Something between a wince and the beginning of a smile. "I know what you must think of me." "I think you were offered a political arrangement and accepted it," Seren said. "Which is precisely what you were raised to do." "I don't hold that against you." Mira looked at her with something that appeared to be genuine surprise. "Most people in your position would." "Most people in my position are spending their energy on the wrong person," Seren said simply. A pause. "Is there anything you need?" Mira asked. "I have some influence over the household arrangements. If there are things being withheld." "The kitchen has been adequate," Seren said, which was true since the third day. Mira nodded. Started to turn, then stopped. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, not quite meeting Seren's eyes, "I didn't know." "About the child." "He didn't tell me." The hallway was quiet. "No," Seren said. "I don't imagine he did." She closed the door gently. Stood in the center of her small room. He hadn't told her. His chosen mate. His political solution. He had carried the knowledge of Seren's pregnancy and not shared it, which meant he had been living alongside it in private, turning it over in the specific way of a man who cannot resolve something and cannot release it either. She did not know what to do with that information. She filed it away in the place where she kept things that were true, but currently without a useful category. Then she lay down on the narrow bed, pressed her palm against her stomach, and let the child's steady presence be the only thing that mattered for a while. Chapter 5. Born into a pack that didn't want her. The labor began at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in late February, 3 weeks before the healer's estimated date. Seren had spent enough time with her own body over the preceding weeks to know the difference between the false tightenings she had been experiencing since January and the real thing. She lay still for 20 minutes, timing them in her head, checking the intervals with the calm practicality of a woman who has spent 8 months making decisions alone and has become fluent in the language of her own endurance. Then she got up, because lying down was suddenly intolerable, and stood at the window watching the courtyard fill with snow, and breathed through the first serious wave with her hands flat against the glass. She was not going to call for help. This was not stubbornness. Or rather, it was not only stubbornness. It was the accumulated weight of 8 months of understanding exactly who in this house would come willingly, who would come resentfully, and who would not come at all. The healer had made her position clear through a series of postponed appointments and abbreviated examinations. The pack women who might have helped were the same women who had moved away from her in the ceremony circle. She would manage. She was always managing. The second wave arrived harder than the first, stealing her breath more completely than she had anticipated. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and breathed through it in the measured counts she had read about in the midwifery text she had purchased in Ashfin and studied with the dedication of someone who understood that information was the only preparation available to her. The third wave arrived while she was still recovering from the second. She bit back the sharp sound that tried to escape her and became, involuntarily, a short, bitten-off cry that she did not intend to be audible through a closed door in the middle of the night. Then a knock. Quiet, but immediate. Seren. His voice. On the other side of the door, calm and steady, carrying the particular quality of someone who has been awake and listening. She had the sudden, disorienting understanding that he had perhaps not slept deeply in weeks. That the footsteps she sometimes heard in the corridor outside her room at odd hours were not, as she had told herself, the general movement of a large household. "Seren, I'm coming in." "I'm fine," she said, which was partially true and mostly a reflex. I know, he said, in the tone of someone who is not arguing the point, but is also not stopping. The door opened. He took in the scene, her at the window, the tension in her shoulders, the slight sheen at her temples. With a single glance and moved immediately to her side. How long, he asked. About 40 minutes since they started properly. 3 weeks early. She breathed out slowly. I was going to manage. You were, he agreed, without a trace of condescension. Where do you want to be? The question, so simple, so entirely about her preference, briefly undid her. She swallowed. Not the bed yet. Standing is better. Then we stand, he said. He positioned himself beside her, close enough to be useful, far enough to give her the space of her own body, and she understood in that arrangement the particular intelligence of a person who knows the difference between support and intrusion. The healer arrived 20 minutes later, sleep-rumpled and visibly put out at the hour. She assessed the situation with the brisk efficiency of professional obligation and began her preparations without warmth. Aldrich did not leave. The healer looked at him once, as though to suggest his presence was irregular. He looked back at her with the calm, dark, entirely immovable expression that Seren was coming to recognize as his particular form of statement, the expression that said, I am remaining, and the next move in this conversation is yours. The healer returned to her preparations. Labor is, among other things, a long conversation with your own limits. Seren had read this in the midwifery text and had noted it as the kind of thing that sounds like a metaphor until it isn't. The hours passed in waves, each one a negotiation. She stood, she moved, she leaned against the wall when her legs required it, she accepted water when Aldrich held it out without comment. She did not make sounds when she could help it, and when she could not help it she did not apologize for them. Aldrich talked to her. Not constantly. Not about anything that required her to respond. He talked about small things, a territory dispute the council had mediated in the southern pacts, the correct method of repairing a specific type of saddlery, the particular architecture of the council's northern hall with its famously impractical staircases. His voice was low and steady, a current beneath the labor's demanding surface, giving her something to follow when the waves crested highest. Stay with me, he said once, during one of the harder passages, his hand at her back, steady pressure. Just breathe. You've survived everything they've thrown at you. A pause. This part is yours. This part is only yours. She found in that sentence something to hold. The child arrived just before dawn. A girl. She was, without question, unmistakably, luminously a girl. The healer's breath caught in the sudden quiet. Even the woman's professional armor could not entirely absorb the sight of what she was holding. The infant's skin carried a quality that was not quite like other newborn skin, not simply pale, but luminous in the way that certain stones are luminous, as though lit from within. Her hair, dark and damp with birth, already carried at its edges the faintest threads of silver white. When her eyes opened, they were the color of moonlight on snow. The healer looked at the child, looked at Seren. Looked at the child again. Moon's breath, she whispered. And for the first time in their acquaintance, her voice held something genuine. Seren held out her arms. The moment the child was placed against her chest, the world reorganized itself entirely. Every reference point she had used to navigate the preceding 8 months shifted and settled into a new configuration around this single, extraordinary weight. 7 pounds of luminous, furious, absolutely complete person, screaming her opinions into the February dawn with the total conviction of someone who has arrived somewhere and has immediate notes. Seren laughed. A broken, wet, exhausted sound that was also the most purely joyful she had ever heard from her own throat. Hello, she whispered, her lips against the dark, silver-threaded hair. Hello, little one. I know. You can say it. The screaming subsided into something smaller. The child turned her impossible eyes upward, and Seren had the overwhelming, irrational certainty that she was being looked at. Truly looked at. Assessed and recognized. Lyra, Seren said. It arrived fully formed, the way true things do. Your name is Lyra. Aldrich had moved to the window when the delivery reached its final stages, giving her what privacy he could within the boundaries of not being willing to leave entirely. She heard him turn at the first cry. When she looked up, he was watching her hold the child with an expression so unguarded that she saw it fully before he had time to compose it. Something vast and quiet, moved beyond what he had prepared to feel by something he had not anticipated. He looked away first. Back to the window. "She's beautiful," he said, very quietly. Not performing the observation. Simply stating it, because it was true and withholding it seemed wrong. "Yes," Seren agreed. She looked down at Lyra, who had taken hold of her finger with a grip of startling conviction, and appeared to have no intention of releasing it. "Yes," she said again, softer. "She is." Cain came at mid-morning. The healer had gone. Aldrich had stepped out to send word to the council. Seren was sitting up in bed, washed and changed, with Lyra asleep against her chest, when the knock came and Cain opened the door without waiting for an answer, which was, she reflected, a lifelong habit that had never once served either of them. He stopped inside the doorway. He looked at the child. The expression on his face was complicated in a way she had never seen from him before, and she had once believed she had seen every register he possessed. It was not simple pride, though that was present. It was not guilt, though she suspected that lived somewhere beneath it. It was something more primary and more helpless, the expression of a person encountering something they did not calculate for, something that has arrived past all their preparations and found the undefended part. He was silent for a long time. "She's remarkable," he said finally. His voice was quiet, stripped of its alpha register. Just a voice. "Yes," Seren said. "She is." She looked down at Lyra's sleeping face, at the silver white threading her hair, at the luminous, unearthly quality of her skin in the morning light. "And she doesn't know you exist," Seren continued, her voice equally quiet. "I'd like to keep it that way. For now." The words were not cruel. She was not, at this point, interested in cruelty. She was interested in accuracy. "She deserves," he began. "She deserves everything," Seren agreed. "And I will spend my life making sure she has it. Whatever I decide she needs to know about you, Cain, I will tell her. When I decide, not when you decide." He stood in the doorway for another moment. "I'm sorry," he said. The two words arrived in the room and Seren let them settle. She did not reach for them. She did not reject them. She simply let them exist in the air between them, acknowledged their presence, and understood that they were real and also insufficient, and that both things could be true simultaneously. "I know," she said. He left. Lyra slept on, one fist curved against her cheek, entirely untroubled. 3 days later, the Elder Council arrived. Seren had been expecting the bloodline formalities, the registration of Lyra's lineage, the council documentation that Aldrich had warned her would be required. She had not been warned about the second document. They assembled in her room without invitation, which was itself a statement. 3 elders, Voss among them, carrying their ceremonial satchels with the particular gravity of men bearing implements of bureaucratic violence. Aldrich arrived at the door behind them, and the expression on his face told her everything before the parchment was unrolled. He had tried. He had not succeeded. The document was ancient, its legal language dense and unambiguous. Pack wardship of a pale wolf heir born within Pack territory. The Pack's right to register the child as a ward of Ironvale, ensuring her access to Pack resources, Pack training, Pack protection. Ensuring, also, the Pack's claim on her future allegiance, her presence during key developmental stages, her eventual role within Pack's structure. It was written to sound like a gift. Seren read it 3 times. "This was signed already," she said. "Alpha Cain signed it this morning," Elder Voss confirmed, with the smoothed expression of a man delivering news he has enjoyed anticipating. Seren looked at the signature. That familiar script, the controlled, upright letters of a man who had been taught that precision was dignity. She looked at it for a long time. Aldrich stood very still near the door. She did not look at him. She did not look at Lyra, sleeping in the small crib near the window, because she knew that if she looked at her daughter in this moment, she would do something that had no good outcome. She folded the document carefully, pressed the fold flat with her thumb, tucked it against her chest. "Thank you, elders," she said, in a voice of absolute composure. Voss blinked. He had expected, she understood, something that he could use. Anger, distress, the evidence of weakness he had always been hunting. "Lady Seren." "Thank you," she repeated pleasantly and looked at the door. They filed out. When the room was empty except for Aldrich, she stood very still for a moment, the document pressed flat against her sternum over the steady beating of her heart. "How long do I have?" she asked quietly. "Legally," Aldrich said carefully, "the wardship doesn't activate for 30 days. There are council review procedures. I can," he paused. "I can create procedural delays. I have authority to request documentation reviews. Each one buys more time." "How much time?" "Enough," he said. And his voice, usually so measured, carried something she had not heard in it before. Urgency. Personal urgency, the kind that belongs to someone with their own stake in the outcome. She turned to look at him. He met her eyes steadily. "Enough," he said again. She nodded once, turned to the window, looked out at the pack house courtyard, the iron gate, the road beyond it that disappeared into the pine-covered hills. She mapped it methodically, the way she had learned to map every space she occupied. Exits, distances, options. Her palm pressed against the document over her heart. She would not let this place claim her daughter. She had survived rejection and banishment, and the brutal winter of her exile, had carried this child through every one of those seasons, had built from nothing a life sufficient to sustain them both. They would not have Lyra. Not Voss, not the elders, not the pack that had put her on her knees in the snow. And not Cain, who had signed his name to her daughter's future as dispassionately as he had signed her own severance. She was already planning. Epilogue. What was planted in winter? 1 year later. April. The council's northern territory sat at the edge of a vast pine forest, where the land opened into meadows in spring, and the air carried a particular clarity that felt nothing like grief. The house was modest by council standards, 3 rooms and a garden, backed against the tree line, fronted by a stretch of grass that was still finding its green in the early April warmth. Seren sat on the stone steps of the front entrance, her face turned toward the afternoon sun, and watched her daughter fall down. Lyra sat with the patient, pragmatic expression of a child who has been falling down all morning and has arrived at a philosophical position on the matter. She regarded the grass beneath her hands for a moment, considered her options, then placed one luminous, silver-threaded fist on the ground, pushed herself upright, and took 3 more wobbling steps before sitting down again. "Obviously," Seren said. Lyra turned and looked at her with those impossible eyes, silver-white and already carrying an expression of absolute opinion, and made a sound of profound commentary. "I agree," Seren told her. Aldrich came out of the house behind her, carrying 2 cups of tea with the careful attention of a man who has decided this small domestic task deserves his full concentration. He settled on the step beside her, handed her a cup, and looked out at Lyra, who had discovered a dandelion and was approaching it with the focused intentionality of a military campaign. "She's going to be terrifying," he said. "Obviously," Seren replied. "She's mine." The corner of his mouth moved. They sat in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had arrived at it from considerable distance, through a long country of words and careful negotiations and the slow, deliberate work of trust built between people who had both learned to be cautious with it. The silence between them now was the other kind. The kind she had once known and had not expected to find again. The kind that asks nothing and gives everything. He had arranged this. The house, the council territory, the legal standing that had taken him 3 months of procedural work, 18 formal review requests, 2 appeals to council members he had served alongside for a decade, and 1 very significant favors called due from the High Council chair himself. He had done it without asking her permission, because he had learned, over months of careful attention, the precise difference between protecting her agency and presenting her with completed doors held open. He had told her only when the paperwork was finished and the keys were in his hand. She had looked at him for a long moment, in the pack house corridor with Lyra against her chest and her travel bag at her feet, and had said, "I would have said yes." "I know," he said, "but I didn't want you to have to." The letter from Cain arrived on a Thursday morning in late March, 6 weeks after they had settled in the northern house. It came through council channels, properly addressed, the iron veil seal pressed into dark wax. Seren set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while before opening it, the way you look at something you have prepared for and are not sure preparation is sufficient for. Aldrich was in the next room. She did not ask him to stay or to leave. He remained where he was, which she understood as its own form of respect. The letter was long. 3 pages in Cain's precise, upright script, and clearly labored over, the kind of writing that carries evidence of multiple drafts in its occasional overformal phrasing, the places where something more natural had been revised into something considered. He wrote of regret in language that did not perform it. He wrote of understanding arriving too late and sitting with that fact rather than asking her to relieve him of it. He wrote that the Stonecrest alliance had been dissolved, not because of Seren, he was careful to say, but because he had come to understand what he had traded and found the territory insufficient compensation for the loss. He wrote that he hoped one day she might consider allowing him to know his daughter. Not as a right, as a request. He wrote, at the end, simply, "I am sorry. I know that is too small. I am saying it anyway." Seren read it through twice. Set it down. Looked out the kitchen window at the garden, where small green things were beginning to push up through the April soil. She thought about the girl she had been. Standing in a ceremony hall with a brand moving toward her wrist, deciding that she would not give them the sound of her pain. Walking out of that hall on her own feet. Walking through 8 months of exile carrying a child and a kind of anger that she had gradually, through use, refined into something cleaner and more functional. Not bitterness. Bitterness is heavy and requires constant tending. This was something more like clarity. She thought about Lyra, outside in the garden with Aldrich, being prevented from eating a dandelion. She thought about what she wanted her daughter to inherit from her. What lessons she was already writing into the air of their life, whether she intended to or not. She picked up the letter. Held it. Then she set it on the fire. Not from bitterness. She had burned all her bitterness away in that first winter, in the room above the tanner's shop in Ashfin, in the cold nights when the child moved inside her and she chose, again and again, to lean toward the future rather than turn and face the wreckage behind her. Not from cruelty, either. She genuinely wished Cain nothing terrible. She wished him the life he had chosen, the one he had decided was worth what he paid for it, and she hoped the accounting eventually balanced for him. She set the letter on the fire simply because some doors, once closed, are not meant to be walked back through. Some things you survive by walking forward. Only forward, and never looking at what tried to become your grave. Perhaps one day Lyra would want to know her father. Perhaps that conversation would come, in 10 years or 15, carried in on the tide of a daughter's curiosity about her own origins. Seren would not prevent it. She would tell the truth, as she always intended to tell it, in language appropriate to the age of the child receiving it. She would not paint Cain as a monster, because he was not one. He was simply a man who had made a choice and had not understood in time what he was choosing between. But that was a future conversation. This was now. She went back outside to find that Aldrich had apparently failed to prevent the dandelion situation and was now crouching beside Lyra with the patient, unhurried manner of a man redirecting a small person without making the redirection feel like a correction. Not for eating, he was explaining seriously, as though this were a reasonable conversation to be having. For looking at. See? Yellow. Lyra regarded the dandelion with deep skepticism. Then she looked at Aldrich. Then she looked at the dandelion again. Then she attempted to eat it. Or we could discuss this further, Aldrich said, very calmly removing it. Seren laughed, the full unguarded laugh that had returned to her over these months, the one that arrived without effort and without the delay of manufacture. She descended the garden steps and crossed the grass, and Lyra, spotting her approach, abandoned the dandelion debate entirely and made her determined, wobbling way toward her mother with the absolute conviction of someone who has identified the correct destination and intends to reach it. Seren caught her, swept her up, pressed her lips against the silver-white hair and breathed in the particular smell of her daughter, grass and warmth and something luminous that had no name. "I see you've been having opinions," she told her. Lyra placed both hands on Seren's face and offered a comprehensive response. Aldrich stood up, brushing grass from his knees. He looked at them both, and he did not make the expression careful. He let it be what it was, open and clear and containing everything he had not rushed to put into words, because he understood, better than most, that words said too early become obligations rather than gifts. He reached out and tucked a piece of Lyra's silver-threaded hair behind her small ear with a single careful finger. Then he looked at Seren, and she looked back at him. And between them was the understanding that existed between two people who have chosen each other quietly, without ceremony or announcement, in the manner of people who choose things they mean to keep. "Dinner," he said. "I thought I'd make something." "You can cook?" she asked. "I have many undisclosed qualities," he said, turning back toward the house. "Aldrich." He stopped. She shifted Lyra against her hip and looked at him in the afternoon light, this man who had walked into a judgment circle with a leather case and a set of perfectly timed words and had not once, in all the months since, asked her for anything except the opportunity to be nearby. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it." He looked at her for a moment. "Don't mention it," he said softly. She smiled. He turned back toward the house. The afternoon sun caught the silver at his collar, the council insignia he wore out of habit rather than necessity out here, far from the politics of packs and the hierarchies that had tried to define them both. Later, with Lyra asleep and dinner finished and the fire burning low, Seren stood on the small front step in the evening air and looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. She thought of everything she had been called in the past year. Exile. Defiler. Desperate woman. Political complication. Carrier of a bloodline. She thought of everything she actually was. She was a woman who had been planted in rejection, watered by punishment, and had grown into something no one who had known her at her worst moment could have predicted standing in that snow. She was not what they had made her. She had taken what they made and she had composted it, turned it into something useful, grown herself from it with the particular stubbornness of things that grow in difficult conditions and therefore grow strong. She was Lyra's mother. That above all things. That was the architecture of her now, the load-bearing wall around which everything else arranged itself. And she was, she thought, looking back through the lit window at the figure moving quietly in the kitchen, something else as well. Something new. Something that had arrived without her permission and had proven impossible to refuse because it had never once demanded anything of her except the willingness to receive it. She was beginning again. Not from where she had started. You never begin again from where you started. You begin from where you are, with what you have, carrying everything you have survived as equipment rather than weight. She was beginning from here. From this April evening, this ordinary extraordinary life, this garden where things were growing, this house where someone was washing dishes with the specific quiet care of a person who has decided, without announcement, that this is his. Inside, from the bedroom, Lyra made a small sound in her sleep. Seren turned and went back in. And the stars continued appearing one by one, in the vast indifferent beautiful sky, the same stars that had watched over that judgment circle and that ceremony hall and that bitter winter exile, unchanged and unchosen and present for all of it. Witnessing, as stars do, everything. And saying nothing, which was, in the end, enough. Because the story had been written not in the stars, but in the choices made beneath them. In a woman who refused to scream. In a child born luminous into a world that hadn't wanted her. In a man who arrived at exactly the right moment and stayed. In all the small, deliberate, daily acts of a life chosen rather than assigned. That was the whole of it. That was everything. Thank you so much for listening, loves. This one came from a deep place, and I hope it reached one in you. Lyra's story is only just beginning. I have a feeling she's going to demand her own chapter, and honestly, I think she's earned it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I read every single one. See you in the next one. The end.